The servants at Magnolia Ridge Plantation whispered about it for decades afterward. How the mistress, Mrs. Catherine Brennan, a woman of impeccable reputation and refined Southern breeding, lost her mind over an enslaved man. How she would stand at her bedroom window for hours, watching him work in the fields below. How her obsession grew so consuming that one autumn night in 1856, she fled the plantation in nothing but her nightgown, screaming his name into the darkness. But to understand how a respected lady of Charleston society descended into madness, we must go back to the spring of 1854, when a man unlike any other arrived at the plantation. His name was Jacob, though some called him Pretty Jacob behind closed doors, a nickname that carried both admiration and mockery. He stood 6 feet and 5 inches tall, an enormous height for that era, with shoulders broad as a doorframe and hands that could palm a man's head like an apple. But it wasn't his size that made people stare. It was his face, and especially his eyes. Jacob's skin was the color of dark honey, his features a striking mixture of African and European ancestry that created something the plantation owners didn't know how to categorize. His hair fell in loose waves rather than tight curls, and his face possessed a symmetry that even the white overseers remarked upon with uncomfortable fascination. But his eyes were what truly set him apart. A piercing blue, pale as a winter sky, that seemed impossible in his face. They were a genetic lottery, inherited perhaps from some distant ancestor, some forgotten violence in his family's past. Whatever their origin, those eyes were unforgettable. Jacob had been purchased at a Charleston slave auction in March of 1854 for an extraordinary sum. Mr. Richard Brennan, the master of Magnolia Ridge, had initially planned to buy field workers, but when he saw Jacob on the auction block, something made him reconsider. Perhaps it was the man's impressive physical strength, or perhaps it was the potential for breeding stock that might produce equally strong workers. Whatever the reason, he paid nearly twice the usual price and brought Jacob to his plantation 30 miles outside Charleston, South Carolina. Mrs. Catherine Brennan first saw Jacob on April 2, 1854, from the veranda of the big house. She was 28 years old, married for 7 years, to a man 20 years her senior, childless despite the expectations of her society. Her marriage had been arranged for financial and social advantage, a common practice among Charleston's elite. Richard Brennan was wealthy, established and cold. He treated his wife with the same distant courtesy he showed his horses: proper care, adequate provision, but no warmth, no passion, no real connection. Catherine had resigned herself to a life of quiet desperation, filling her days with needlework, piano practice, and the endless social rituals expected of a plantation mistress. She supervised the house slaves with mechanical efficiency, attended church every Sunday, and maintained the perfect facade of Southern womanhood. Inside, she felt like she was slowly disappearing, becoming less real with each passing year. Then she saw Jacob. He was working in the garden below the veranda, clearing brush under the brutal spring sun. His shirt was off, his body gleaming with sweat, his muscles moving beneath his skin like living machinery. But it was when he looked up, when those impossible blue eyes met hers for just a moment, that something cracked in Catherine's carefully constructed world. She told herself it meant nothing. She was a lady. He was property. The very thought of what she felt was not just improper, but dangerous, forbidden by every law and custom of their world. Desire between the races was the ultimate taboo, especially when it involved a white woman and an enslaved man. Such things could lead to lynchings, to violence that would destroy everyone involved. But Catherine couldn't stop thinking about him. She found excuses to be near wherever Jacob was working. She would take her afternoon tea on the veranda when he labored in the garden. She would walk past the stables when he was grooming horses. She would stand at her bedroom window for hours, watching him move through the plantation grounds. Jacob, for his part, understood the danger immediately. He had survived 29 years as an enslaved man by being invisible, by keeping his head down and his eyes lowered. He knew that his unusual appearance made him vulnerable in ways other enslaved people weren't. White men saw him as a threat to be controlled. White women's attention could get him killed. So he avoided looking at Mrs. Brennan, never spoke to her directly, and tried to make himself as inconspicuous as his size allowed. But Catherine's obsession grew like a fever. She began calling him to the house for unnecessary tasks. "Jacob, there's a loose board on the stairs. Jacob, the window in my sitting room won't close properly. Jacob, I need furniture moved in the library." Each summons was a transparent excuse to be near him, to hear his voice when he answered with careful politeness, "Yes, mistress." The other enslaved people noticed. Sarah, the house cook, watched with growing alarm as Mrs. Brennan's behavior became more erratic. "That woman playing with fire," she told old Moses, who managed the stables. "She gonna get that boy killed, and maybe some of us too." Old Moses agreed. He had lived through enough years to know how these situations ended. "Somebody need to talk to Jacob," he said. "Make him understand he got to get away from her somehow." They tried. One evening in July of 1854, old Moses pulled Jacob aside. "Listen here, son. I know you ain't doing nothing wrong, but that white woman got her eye on you, and that's a death sentence waiting to happen. You need to be careful. Don't never be alone with her. Keep other people around whenever she call you to the house." Jacob nodded grimly. "I know I've been trying, but she keep finding reasons to summon me. What am I supposed to do? Tell the mistress no?" There was no good answer to that question. An enslaved person couldn't refuse a direct order from the mistress without risking punishment. Jacob was trapped, and everyone knew it. By August, Catherine's behavior had become impossible to hide. She stopped attending church socials, claiming illness. She lost weight, barely eating, her face taking on a fevered, hollow appearance. She would spend hours in her room, staring out the window. At night, her maid reported hearing her crying, sometimes calling out names in her sleep. Mr. Brennan, absorbed in his business affairs, noticed his wife's decline, but attributed it to female hysteria, a catch-all diagnosis for any behavior in women that men couldn't understand. He brought in doctors who prescribed various tonics and rest cures, none of which addressed the true cause of Catherine's deterioration. Then came the incident that changed everything. On September 15, 1854, Catherine summoned Jacob to her private sitting room, claiming a shelf needed repair. It was late afternoon, and most of the house servants were occupied with dinner preparations. For the first time, they were truly alone. Jacob entered the room with his tools, his heart pounding with apprehension. Catherine stood by the window, her back to him, her posture rigid with tension. "The shelf is there," she said, her voice strange, tight. "By the bookcase." Jacob moved to examine it, hyper-aware of every sound, every movement in the room. The shelf didn't need repair. They both knew it. "Jacob," Catherine said suddenly, turning to face him. Her eyes were wild, desperate. "Look at me, please, just look at me." He kept his gaze down, his jaw clenched. "Mistress, I should go get someone to help with this work. I don't want anyone else," her voice cracked. I just need." She moved toward him, her hand reaching out, and Jacob stepped back so abruptly he knocked over his toolbox. The clatter was like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Mistress, please," he said, his voice low and urgent. "You don't want this. You don't know what you're asking. They'll kill me slow, and they'll make you watch." The brutal truth of his words seemed to penetrate her fever dream. Catherine stopped, her hand still extended, her face crumpling. "I know," she whispered. "God help me, I know, but I can't stop thinking about you. I can't sleep, I can't breathe. What's wrong with me?" Jacob risked looking at her directly, those blue eyes meeting hers with a mixture of pity and fear. "Ain't nothing wrong with you, mistress. You just lonely. But this ain't the answer. This get us both destroyed." Footsteps sounded in the hallway, and they both froze. Sarah's voice called out, "Mistress, you need anything?" "No!" Catherine called back, too quickly, too loudly. "I'm fine." Jacob gathered his tools with shaking hands and fled the room, leaving Catherine standing alone, tears streaming down her face. After that day, something broke in Catherine completely. She stopped pretending to be well. She stopped attending to her duties as mistress of the house. She would wander the plantation at odd hours, always searching for Jacob, though he now actively avoided any place she might be. The servants whispered openly. Mr. Brennan could no longer ignore his wife's condition. In October, he confronted her directly. "Catherine, people are talking. Your behavior is causing scandal. What is wrong with you?" She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "What's wrong with me? I'm trapped in a life I never chose." married to a man who feels nothing for me, expected to be grateful for my cage. That's what's wrong with me. This is about that slave, isn't it? Brennan's voice was dangerously quiet. Don't think I haven't heard the whispers. My own wife, making a spectacle over a piece of property. He has a name, Catherine screamed. He's a person, not property, and he's worth 10 of you. Brennan slapped her, the first and only time he ever raised his hand to her. She fell to the floor, touching her bleeding lip, and smiled up at him with mad triumph. Go ahead, beat me, lock me up. It doesn't matter anymore. Nothing matters. Brennan made arrangements to have Jacob sold immediately to a plantation in Mississippi where he would be far away and the scandal could be buried. But before the sale could be finalized, Catherine's obsession reached its terrible climax. On the night of October 28, 1854, the house slaves were awakened by screaming. They found Mrs. Brennan in her nightgown, running through the plantation grounds in the darkness, calling Jacob's name over and over. Her feet were bleeding from running across rough ground. Her hair had come loose and streamed behind her like a white banner in the moonlight. "Jacob! Jacob, where are you? Don't leave me! Don't let them take you away!" Mr. Brennan and several overseers chased her through the darkness. They found her at Jacob's cabin, pounding on the door, sobbing hysterically. Jacob stood inside, frozen with horror, knowing that this moment would seal both their fates. She was physically carried back to the big house, screaming and fighting the entire way. A doctor was summoned from Charleston, and Catherine was diagnosed with acute nervous hysteria with delusional fixation. The doctor recommended immediate commitment to an asylum. The next morning, before dawn, Jacob was sold to a slave trader for transport to Mississippi. He left Magnolia Ridge in chains, never having spoken more than a handful of words to the woman whose obsession had destroyed them both. Old Moses watched him go, shaking his head at the waste of it all. Catherine Brennan was committed to the South Carolina Lunatic Asylum in Columbia on November 2, 1854. She would spend the next 2 years there, subjected to the brutal treatments of the era. Cold water therapy, isolation, doses of laudanum that kept her in a drugged stupor. Her family told their social circle that she had gone to visit relatives in Europe. The truth was too shameful to acknowledge, but something unexpected happened during those 2 years of confinement. Slowly, gradually, the fog of obsession lifted from Catherine's mind. Away from the plantation, away from the impossible situation that had consumed her, she began to think clearly for the first time in months. She realized that what she had felt wasn't really about Jacob at all. He had simply been a symbol, a focal point for all her rage and desperation about her trapped life. She also came to understand the terrible danger she had put him in, how her selfish obsession had nearly gotten him lynched. The guilt of this realization was perhaps what finally broke the fever of her madness. In 1856, Catherine was released from the asylum, declared cured. But she didn't return to Magnolia Ridge. Instead, in a move that shocked Charleston society, she divorced Richard Brennan, using her family's money and connections to secure one of the rare divorces granted in that era. She moved to Boston, as far from the South as she could get, and never married again. In Boston, Catherine became involved with the abolitionist movement, though she never spoke publicly about her own experience. She used her inherited wealth to fund Underground Railroad operations, helping enslaved people escape to freedom. Those who worked with her noted that she seemed driven by a fierce, almost desperate need to make amends for something, though she never explained what. Jacob's fate took an unexpected turn as well. In Mississippi, he worked on a cotton plantation for 2 years before escaping in 1856, following the North Star to freedom. He made it to Canada, settling in a small community of formerly enslaved people near Toronto. He married, had children, and lived to the age of 67, dying in 1892. His descendants still live in Ontario, and some of them inherited his striking blue eyes. Years later, in 1873, an elderly woman in Boston received news that a man named Jacob Wilson, formerly enslaved in South Carolina, had written a memoir about his escape to freedom. Catherine Brennan, now 67 years old, purchased the book and read it cover to cover in one sitting. Jacob mentioned Magnolia Ridge only briefly, noting that he had been sold from there due to circumstances beyond my control. and that he had been grateful to leave even in chains, because sometimes leaving is the only form of freedom available. Catherine never tried to contact him. Some debts, she understood, could never be repaid. But she continued her work with the abolitionist cause until her death in 1881, and in her will, she left a substantial sum to support education for formerly enslaved people. The story of Catherine Brennan and Jacob serves as a complex reminder of how slavery corrupted every human relationship it touched. Catherine's obsession wasn't really love. It was the desperate grasping of a woman who had no control over her own life, seeking agency in the most destructive way possible. Jacob was never seen as a person in her fever dream, but as an object of desire, a symbol of rebellion against her constraints. Both were victims of a system that denied humanity to everyone it touched, though in vastly different ways. Jacob survived because he understood the mortal danger he faced and never allowed himself to respond to Catherine's attention. Catherine survived because she was eventually able to see past her obsession to the reality of what she had done. The incident at Magnolia Ridge was whispered about in Charleston society for decades, though the details were deliberately obscured. Most people heard only that Mrs. Brennan had suffered a nervous collapse and divorced her husband, both scandalous enough without the fuller truth. The plantation itself continued operating until the Civil War, when it was burned by Sherman's troops in their march to the sea. What remains is a cautionary tale about obsession, power, and the impossible situations created by a society built on the ownership of human beings. It speaks to the ways that slavery poisoned not just the obvious relationships between enslaved and enslaver, but twisted human emotions into dangerous and destructive forces that left everyone damaged in their wake.